Good evening. Good evening. My name is Susan Morrow, and I am co-president of the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society. So I want to welcome you on behalf of the Historical Society and the Anti-Kent California Room, Marin County Free Library. We're very excited about our joint presentation tonight, and I wanted to give you an overview of who you would be hearing from. You'll hear a few remarks from Lori Thompson, who is the head librarian and archivist at the Anti-Kent California Room. You'll hear a few remarks from Heather McPhail-Schreederin, co-president of the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society. And also from Richard Torney, local historian, who will discuss the history of Kentfield and Greenbrae in photos, and the featured presentation tonight from Dewey Livingston, local historian, author, and map archivist, who will be speaking to the main topic, Kentfield and Greenbrae transformed over time, historic maps, photos, and more. Thank you so much for joining us. We will also be having a question and answer period hosted by Carol Acquaviva, librarian and digital archivist at the Marin County Free Library, Anti-Kent California Room. So on with the show. I'll hand it over to Lori Thompson.
Yes, hello everyone, and welcome. I am Lori Thompson, joined this evening by my California Room colleagues, Carol Acquaviva and Dewey Livingston. And of course, Dewey is one of our speakers this evening. And we wish to really extend a big thanks to the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society, who invited us to partner with them this evening. And on behalf of the California Room, we would also like to invite you to explore our website and digital archive, which has abundant resources curated on Marin County history, including that of the greater Ross Valley, Kentfield, and Greenbrae. And we've recently actually posted brand new web pages, and they're arranged thematically. We hope you'll enjoy that. And so please explore that later on. And we're all greatly looking forward to a joint presentation by two very eminent local historians, my friends Richard Torney and Dewey Livingston, who are going to be transcending the barriers of time and space as they take you on a really fascinating journey through Kentfield and Greenbrae, and using all kinds of interesting tools, including photos, historical maps, and aerial views. And I do want to mention that many of the rare historical maps, which will form part of Dewey's presentation, are available on our digital archive. And we have actually over 3,000 of those maps posted. So please know that you can revisit all of that later. And without further ado, I want to turn now to introduce our colleague and friend at the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society, Heather McPhail-Schreederin, a co-president of that organization this year. Heather.
Great, thanks, Lori. Good evening, everyone. My name is Heather McPhail-Schreederin, and I am a co-president of the KGHS, along with Marilee Rogers and Susan Morrow. The KGHS is an all-volunteer nonprofit that was born during efforts to organize and celebrate the 2014 centennial of Kent School. Organizing this celebration was the idea of Bob Kane, a longtime superintendent of the Kentfield School District, who always held a fervent interest in preserving the history of the schools and communities they served. Bob also wanted to publish a history of Kentfield Greenbrae and the surrounding areas to recognize and record the events and efforts made by individuals, groups, and businesses that shape these communities. As the KGHS volunteers planned the 100-year celebration and conducted a considerable amount of research, we wisely enlisted the help of author and historian Dewey Livingston to create the book. His extensive research over several years, combined with his collaboration with community volunteers and Kent Middle School 8th graders, collecting over 100 oral history interviews for the project, resulted in a captivating 400-page history entitled In the Heart of Marin. Today, the KGHS continues to promote and share local history through its lectures, community events, partnerships, and school programs. For more information about the KGHS, to become a member, or to buy our book, In the Heart of Marin, please be sure to visit our website at www.kghs.org. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce one of the featured speakers of the evening, fellow KGHS board member and friend, Richard Torney. Richard is a fourth generation born in San Francisco and a lifelong resident of Marin County. He attended Kent School, Redwood High, and COM. Richard served in the US Army in Vietnam and recently retired from a career as a remodeling contractor. As an amateur local historian, he is actively involved with the KGHS, the Moya Library, Ross Historical Society, and the Northwestern Pacific Railroad Historical Society. He also volunteers as a docent at the Gravity Car Barn on Mount Tamalpais. Welcome, Richard. And as Richard gets set up, I'd like to remind everyone of two items. One is for your best viewing experience, I'd encourage you to go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and click on the box that says View and adjust the settings to be side-by-side screen share. And the second, I just wanted to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone via email and also posted on the California Room and KGHS websites. Welcome, Richard.
Well, thank you, Heather. So I've been invited to be the opening act for Dewey's show. And so here we go. I'm going to be showing you photographs, old and new, of Kentfield and Greenbrae. And I want to make it fast. So here we go. This is one of the oldest photos of this area. It was then known as Ross Landing. And you see sailboats came up Corte Madera Creek. And here you see one loading cordwood. There were many products available from the Ross Valley. And this port was one of the most important ports on San Francisco Bay for all the materials and products they could provide for the rapidly growing San Francisco. In the background on the right, you see some buildings that would have been along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, somewhere between Colonial Liquors and College Avenue. And in the distance on the left, the building you see would have been on College Avenue. Now, one of these sailboats made 2 or 3 round trips from Ross Landing to San Francisco weekly. And that continued until all of the logging, agriculture, and other development caused siltation, and the creek was no longer navigable. Now, if you look at that same place today, it looks like it's wide enough to sail a boat in, but when the tide is low, you're not going to bring a sailboat in there. So this is a painting that was done by artist Joseph Lee in 1870 titled A Small Town in Marin County. And at that time, it was Ross Landing. And I want to point out that road that comes in from the distance is today's College Avenue, but it was the main road, the main highway for all north and south traffic through Marin County, starting from the ferry in Sausalito, winding its way through to this point, which was later called Kentfield Corners. And then traffic going off to the right would go to San Anselmo, where you could either go out to the coast and take that route north or go into Santa Fe and take the inland route. A little closer look, you can see the bridge across Corte Madera Creek is much closer to Sir Francis Drake Boulevard than it is today. And that's because there's a big curve in the creek. Well, Dewey's going to be talking to you about that soon. I want to point out that the house on the right at that corner was the home of Paul Treyanton, who was the captain of that sailing ship that made the weekly, multi-weekly trips to and from Ross Landing in San Francisco. Now, this photograph taken some time later is of his family on the porch of that same house. In the middle, you see his widow, the matriarch, and some of his children and grandchildren. Now remember, this is the main highway. So as automobile traffic increased, the Triantons kept with the times and they opened Trianton Service Station. So it's associated gasoline with auto supplies, light lunch and refreshments. Later, that operation was taken over by Frank Berthanier. Here you see him putting a quart of oil in Dr. Fong's 1934 Buick. That's the Kentfield Fire Department right across the street. Frank later expanded the gas station to have 3 service bays and 2 gas pump islands. And Frank's son, Frank Berthanier Jr., had his career with the Kentfield Fire Department right across the street. So it wasn't unusual to see fire trucks over at the gas station. Now, after the gas station closed, a very brief time, this was Poor Richard's organic produce store, but it was later replaced by a business many people remember, the Taqueria. And that operated for many years, but finally the College of Marin's expansion and remodeling plans entailed removing all of the buildings along College Avenue, including the gas station. And they leveled everything off, and now it's the site of the administration and classrooms on College Avenue. Now, this is a view looking up Highway 101, the main road, towards Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. Notice the boardwalk on the left. That area is right by the creek and frequently flooded. And here's a flood in 1962 with a bunch of Kent School 8th grade girls hamming it up for the photographer. A place I'm sure you're all familiar with, the crossing in front of Kent School. Now, Albert Kent and Adeline Kent bought property in this area around 1871 and built their home and estate. And customary of the time, it didn't have a street address, it had a name. They called it Tamalpais for the view of the mountain. And it was a grand home. So here's a view looking down from the hills, and you can see the Kent's home on the lower right and lower Ross Valley, relatively undeveloped. Well, today there's still a big house down there where the Kent house was, but there's very little land that isn't developed. Now, big changes came to this area, including all of Marin, when the North Pacific Coast Narrow Gauge Railroad began operation in 1875 with steam engines pulling freight and passenger cars. And the first station was named Tamalpais after the Kent property. I notice there's a chicken in the lower right. I'm not sure whether it's waiting for a train or just there. And I want to point out the vines growing up the end of the building. Now, this next photograph, that dark spot in the middle is that same station with the vines completely covering it. And in the foreground, today's College Avenue, but again, it's the main road, it's Highway 101. Also notice the elm trees along the left. They're going to be showing up again shortly. Now, town grew and it switched from Ross Landing to Kentfield. And yes, there were fields in Kentfield. So here we see Elizabeth Kent behind the wheel of her 1911 white Torpedo with her husband, Congressman William Kent, in the back, and that they're at the entrance to their estate. They're waiting for that southbound electric train, which is on its way to Sausalito. And there's that same row of elm trees. Now remember, this is Highway 101. So you get stuck behind an old truck, it's going to be a slow drive. But and that's right at the railroad crossing, and you can see that steam trains pulling freight or passenger trains came right through town, as well as electric trains. And here's a rainy day in Kentfield, of which there have been many in the past, but we could use a few more this year. Now, in 1928, they modernized the station and put in this mission-style building, Kentfield's train station. And here, this photograph in 1939, you see a building off to the right. That was the new post office, as the trains had lost a lot of their passengers due to the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge, and they were struggling to stay profitable. But February 28th, 1941 was the last day these electric trains operated. And one of the first sections of track to be torn up was between Larkspur and San Anselmo. So this was what was left. You can see the patches in the pavement where the tracks had just been torn up. An old timer told me, that's Tony Milani's 1938 International flatbed truck right in the foreground, right behind those elm trees again. And you can see Kent Avenue has been added on the left-hand side of the trees. Now, when the tracks were pulled up, the ownership of the property reverted to the Kent family, and they went ahead and started developing by building a gas station with the trees behind it. And in this picture, you can see in the background the construction of the Jolly Market, which would have been 1957. Now, that store went through a number of changes, and today is the Woodland store. Shell Station was first a Valero, and now it's the 24/7. So as the Woodland Center developed, when they built the building that housed the Woodlands restaurant, the storefront to the left of the flagpole on the top was where the post office moved. And there's the elm trees in the background again. So the old post office wasn't torn down. It was picked up and moved down the street. And I'm sure you all remember driving by that just into Larkspur. Now, moving further downstream, here we see Corte Madera Creek. Now, on the left is the Bonaire Hotel, and there's a road that goes to a drawbridge so that guests and people living on the other side could get to the train station. And looking far to the right on this photograph, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You see a row of eucalyptus trees. That was the windbreak that was built or planted for the Greenbrae Dairy. And for many years, those trees served as a rookery for great blue herons. So here's another look at the Bonaire Hotel and the drawbridge on the left. Now, the easement for that drawbridge was reactivated when they built the concrete bridge there in the early 1960s, which is where the bridge that's being rebuilt is now today. The hospital would have been on the land just to the left of Bonaire Hotel. Now, here we are at the Greenbrae train station. Notice it's two words, Greenbrae. That dairy was first opened by James Ross's son, who was also named James Ross, and he named it that to honor his father's Scottish ancestral homeland. And there's a chicken at that station too. So that was originally serviced by steam trains that came from Tiburon on their way to Santa Fe and north as far as Eureka on the inland route. And in this photograph, we're looking across Highway 101 in the early days. You can see the Greenbrae station on the right and the tunnel in the distance. And notice Highway 101 is only 3 lanes, one for northbound traffic, one for southbound traffic, and the middle lane was for left turns and passing, and often known as the suicide lane. Now, the new smart Larkspur station is very close to where the Greenbrae station was, but now Highway 101 has 5 lanes northbound and 4 lanes southbound in that area. Now, there aren't very many photographs of the Greenbrae Dairy. This is one of them. And here's another that's looking across Sir Francis Drake Boulevard towards the dairy you see in the background. And there's still some of those eucalyptus trees there. Approximately where Alicio Drive is today. Now, here's a photograph of Greenbrae School, which was part of the development of Greenbrae, and there's still some eucalyptus trees and the dairy in the background. Now, there were still cows grazing around the school and in the hills in the early days of the development of Greenbrae. So there's one mooing, and here's a whole bunch of them. And so for local residents and those students, the sound of a clanking cowbell in the nearby pasture was quite common. Another view across Greenbrae School, you can see the Chevron Station, which is still there today. Many houseboats on the creek on the far left, and just peeking around the knoll in the middle, you see the Bonaire Market. Now, this photograph on the right is Jeff Kramer with his brother and sister breaking ground for what would be their 3rd home in Greenbrae on La Cuesta. And Jeff said there were still cows across the street when they were building this house. Now, this is Jeff's 1st grade class in 1956 at Greenbrae School. If you look in the background, well, there's one house under construction and a couple other ones peeking through, but not much else. Well, the school was closed, the land was sold, and the new developer built many more buildings, and they did preserve the name of the Greenbrae School in the park. Now, this is the grand opening of the Bonaire supermarket in November of 1952, and you see the parking lot filled with cars of the day. This photograph just a few years ago was one of the hot rod shows down there, and David M. Bryan is in the same space where the grocery store had been. And I guess there's a chance that some of these cars in this picture may have been there for the grand opening. Across the street was the Greenbrier Company sales office, which is today Caldwell Bankers. And I'm going to wrap up now with this view looking down over the Greenbrae Dairy. You can see cows grazing on the hills. Sir Francis Drake Boulevard is a narrow country road, and there are some houseboats along the creek. And that hill you see in the left center is now covered with condominiums and apartments, and on the top is the Tamalpais. So now we're ready for Dewey Livingston, who was the author of this book here. Now Dewey has his family was living in Kentfield when he graduated from Redwood High School, and one of his early career projects was an in-depth survey of buildings and historic sites in the GGNRA. Dewey has conducted many similar surveys all around California and really in states all along the west side of our country. Dewey has been very active with a number of historical societies. He's on the board of directors of the Marin County Historical Society in the 1980s, and currently is on the board of directors of the Jack Mason Museum in Inverness. Now, Dewey lives in Inverness with his wife, Carrie, who is a librarian in Stinson Beach. Dewey has conducted many oral histories with local people, taken photographs, written articles, published a number of books about local history, and is on the staff of the Antique Kent, California room at Marin County Civic Center Library, but spends most of his time over in the Map Annex. And in the Map Annex, he has access to a number of maps, surveys, drawings, photographs, and documents, mostly about Marin County history. So now I'm proud to introduce Dewey Livingston to let him explain what he has found. So welcome, Dewey Livingston.
Thank you, everybody. And I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you, Richard, for the nice introduction and the always enjoyable slideshow of old photos of our area. So I guess I will share my screen. All right, are we there? Good. Well, this talk tonight is kind of a takeoff of one that we did about 2.5 years ago, of using the concept of before and after, or before and present, and comparing views. But for the past 10 or so years, I've been looking at it more from the air. So I'm interested in how things looked. You get such a great view when you're up in the air, if you're flying over something, or if you're looking at aerial photos or satellite photos, and you can learn so much from those, and also from your from the maps that you can have, whether they be current ones or old ones. And so here's our Google Earth view of the Ross Valley on the right, and Corte Madera, Larkspur, and even Mill Valley over towards the left. And what's really fun is to then take us back in time and get a sense of what that looked like a long time ago. This photo was taken in the 1920s. And you can see that where most of the development today in the 101 corridor used to be marshes and wetlands. And that's what we're going to look at a lot tonight. Not entirely, but this is a photo that we could just spend an hour talking about the details of this photo, but we're not going to do that tonight. I'm going to use a variety of maps. One that is most interesting in use of talking about the Corte Madera Creek is the Tidelands map. This is number 7. It was made in 1871. Corte Madera Creek's in the top part of it, and we'll look at some details of that. But these were produced as a way of surveying and getting ready for marketing wetlands that could be developed. They could be filled and built upon. And so they actually created lots on those. And they also realigned the creek, at least through a map, and with the idea that the navigable waterway would someday see bigger ships. And so they planned out what they call the Corte Madera Canal, which is now has been done about 100 years later. They actually did do the dredging and widening. I love the old legends of maps. One of the tidelands of Marin County. This is the one that covers Corte Madera Creek area. I'm also going to use old surveys, most of which are from the Anti-Kent California Room's Map and Special Collections Annex, where we have tens of thousands of historical survey maps dating from 1849 to 1988. And so you'll see quite a few of those. And then something I really love is aerial photos, historical aerial photos. This is one from 1952. These are available through the U.S. Geological Survey. 1946, Corte Madera Creek in the bottom and San Rafael at the top. And many of our favorite is 1931, a series that's available through UC Santa Barbara's special geospatial collection in their library. And 1931 really takes you back for a lot of this detail. So we're going to look at a lot of that. And there has been some work done in cooperation with the California Room that's called the Marin Historical Map and Imagery, or MHMI, using Google Earth to use these historic maps. So when we look at this view of Corte Madera Creek and Greenbrae at the top and Larkspur and Corte Madera in the bottom, have been able to overlay historic aerial photos to it. And look at how much things have changed. This is an almost precise overlay. So we're going to look at some of that a little more as we go on. But I wanted to first get us set up with the geography of the area where so many of the participants here live. The dark green is solid land and hills. The light green is marshland, and the blue is water, of course. And we have our San Quentin Peninsula up at the top, Point San Pedro, San Rafael Bay, the Ross Valley, Mount Tamalpais. And here's where our towns are: San Rafael, Ross, Kentfield, etc. And so you can see that in the marsh around Greenbrae, in fact, here I'm going to zoom in a little, the marsh around Greenbrae and Kentfield, there are all these little points that stick out, like this one here, which is near where the bowling alley used to be in the eastern part of Bonaire Shopping Center. This is Bonaire Hill, and where the Marin General Hospital, and now called Marin Health. Here's where Miramonte is. And so we're going to be looking at a lot of these details. This is to give you a sense of where we are. And I'm especially interested in the islands that were in the marsh that we'll be talking about. Wood Island, which is adjacent to Larkspur Landing and has office buildings on it. Richardson's Island, which is no longer there, but is occupied by some development that you'll recognize when we get to that. And Tennant Hill, which is one of the smaller islands, which is where Redwood High School is now. So, so this is what we're looking at in a pure natural form. And if we take that vision and take an old map, this is from 1860, you can see the way they've depicted all those vast marshes leading up to Kentfield. Where in the upper left where you see Cooper, that's about where the Kent estate is. And Buckaloo is where Ross is. And Gilman's in the upper center is Greenbrae, about where the shopping center is. And you can see the San Quentin prison is already in place in 1860. And then here is that 1871 Tidelands map where they depict the Corte Madera Canal, which hasn't been built yet, but it's all planned out. So as you go up the creek, they've actually widened on the map the existing creek. And you can even see up in this area where they've put a straight channel to bypass these bunch of curves. And that did eventually happen about 100 years later. It's wonderful looking at old maps of details. Was surveyed in 1899. This is where Highway 101 crosses Corte Madera Creek and heads up over the hill to San Rafael. But look at how they depict the marshes. These ones are quite precise. All the little sloughs going in. And then we have our islands. Here's Richardson's Island that I mentioned, and Tennant Hill, and some ponds. It's these kind of maps that have inspired so many of our local historians to get into detail on well, what was going on here and where exactly was it. Now, Richard showed this picture. Corte Madera Creek was very busy in the 1860s and 70s. That really slowed down by 1880 or so with siltation in the creek and just other uses. But you can see the banks are bare. They're piling up cordwood that have been taken out of the hills. You're looking towards Bald Hill and the College of Marin and College Avenue, where those buildings are behind. And whenever you look at a distant view around the Kentfield area, almost always you'll see in the distance those beautiful marshes, and then the hills covered with oak trees and bay trees and buckeyes. And it's just a lovely place. Here again, you're looking out in towards the bay with the winding creek. This is where the Bonaire Hotel was. You can probably even see the little white thing where the hotel, the Kent Estate. So lovely, lovely views. The creek was a vital waterway. It had a lot to do with the environment here. There was a while that we were dumping our sewage in it, but that got corrected. This is the creek in its more natural form as it went through the College of Marin area. And here is the creek as it made a deep loop in towards the Greenbrae Ranch. We love this picture, the lupin-covered hills in the spring. That curve was straightened out, as you'll see in some later photos. And this section that you're seeing now, it was filled in and is now the eastern part of the Greenbrae, the Bonaire Shopping Center, and a lot of the housing behind it that faces the creek. And of course, the hill has the Tamalpais and et cetera on it. So here's the picture Richard showed, but this is a little sharper because I'm going to talk about that bend in the creek. 1870 view of Ross Landing. And in the foreground going across is what's now Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. Back then it was called the Ross Landing to Junction or San Anselmo Road. And then this is College Avenue heading out towards Larkspur. This is Kent Woodlands up here, that bowl. And so there you have it. So notice the creek, as Richard pointed out, curves around and under a bridge and back around. We have this wonderful old map in the California Room collection that shows the two different channels of Corte Madera Creek. And this one to the west was bypassed, and they made this one into the major channel. I talked about that last talk. And so this is sort of a moribund creek, and a lot of it is underground. This is the College of Marin parking lot now, and there's nothing there left. And they call it Murphy Creek now, but it's barely even a creek. But here is that bend, when you go over to the right here, the bend in the creek. And you look at other maps, here's the Tideland Survey map, big wide bend there, right in the middle of Ross Landing. Peter Smith's store, he was one of the, you could call him the father of Kentfield. He really got things going there. That curve, this might seem minor, but it's fascinating when you're interested in maps and surveys and how the land has changed, that curve in the creek ended up causing a little bit of trouble. Look at this piece of land that Peter Smith had. It had that very awkward point on it because it was following the creek. And that was about all he could get from Butler, his neighbor, in order to buy. And then when they started surveying, even after they had changed the creek, look at the jumble of building parcels of lots that were created in this part of College Avenue. This is Sir Francis Drake up here in the corner of College Avenue. Here's where the creek is now in the channel. But look at all this going on here. And that's because the creek used to go up and around. And I'll show you an aerial photo, a little fuzzy. Here they've straightened the creek, but you can see by the fence lines and some of the vegetation how the creek used to be there. The shadow of the old creek is still there. Well, they would have taken all this dirt from here and dumped it into the creek there to create all this land. And you still even see it today when, here's a current Google Earth just by the way the trees are in the back of here's the Half Day Cafe. And I'm forgetting now what's in where the Pacific, where the fish restaurant and then pizza was. And then the storage, you can see it's just very odd and awkward parcels here. College of Marin took over this whole piece, so there's really not much evidence. But that's in a minor way how we have changed Corte Madera Creek, but you're going to see later how much we've changed it in an even more major way. And I just like to show this picture from the College of Marin archives. Here's College of Marin, and you can see coming towards you Corte Madera Creek when it has been basically destroyed and drained because they were building the concrete channel in this is 1969, and they even bypassed with the little road here. They made a curve so they could build a new bridge across it. So they're really, with progress, we're really messing around with Mother Nature. So here's our view again, because we're going to look at some views from the Marin Historical Map and Imagery collection using Google Earth, looking towards Greenbrae from a satellite view. And there is what we saw a little earlier, and those differences. Wow, we'll look at those a little more close up. And again, to the map of the tidelands, you can see how they have kind of straightened it out in the map, but they didn't really straighten it out for a while. So here's that little curve at Greenbrae. So to orient yourself, this is Sir Francis Drake Boulevard on the upper right, cutting across, but there's not much development otherwise. The Greenbrier Ranch is here on the far right. And look at how this curves right around, and this is all marshland to the left. And when you compare this exact view, you're not going to even know what happened, because look at that. It's just like a different world. But these images are lined up to be exactly what's there and what was there. Here we're gone downstream just a little with Wood Island in the center that was originally called Egg Island. And can you guess why it was called Egg Island? I think it has that shape. And you can see the 101 highway running up towards San Rafael. You can see Sir Francis Drake heading off into the upper left, and Corte Madera Creek with the Greenbrier Boardwalk in the foreground. And then over here is Hutchinson's Quarry. And let's look at that in the exact same position today. Well, not much has changed down at the Greenbrier Boardwalk, and that's another thing we'll be talking about later. But in the background, an awful lot of change as Marin grew after World War II, and homes were built. And I'm not knocking the fact that homes were built. Sometimes I do wish that I lived back in time when there were fewer cars on the road. Of course, we didn't have seatbelts then. But these are all homes and beautiful neighborhoods that have been constructed here along. So we can look at the changes and go, oh my gosh, what happened? But we also have to remember that we're a growing country and a growing county, and we've made it still a lovely place to live. So I love going back and forth, and I'm going to occasionally do that. See, Larkspur Landing is up in the upper right. And it used to just be the quarry for Hutchinson's. And the Larkspur Ferry Terminal was a channel where they could bring ships in and load gravel onto the ships and rock, where they could then head out to their other places. Let's go back into downtown Kentfield for a while and look at this photo taken from an airplane, and look at those big fields in the center off to the right. That's a vegetable garden. And the place where the College of Marin's old football field and the old gymnasium that burned down in the foreground, right next to the railroad tracks. This picture would have been taken in the 30s. That used to be a farm too. And that was something in my book I really enjoyed writing about because I'm very interested in farming and agriculture. And here you had in downtown Kentfield, dozens of acres of farms. There was another farm closer up to Ross where Granton Park is now. So there you're looking at College Avenue going diagonally and you see those fields. The fields in the distance is where Kent School playing fields and the new gymnasium are. So you go up into the deeper sky and you look in the 20s and you have on the right a vegetable farm and on the left a flower farm. Oh, and that's the College of Marin. That's the Marin Junior College's building, their first building put up in 1926 on the old Butler estate, just to give you a sense of where we are. Richard Diener first experimented with growing wheat in Kentfield. He found that didn't really work out too well. He had the backing of the Kents, and this was Kent's property. So he started a flower farm, mostly selling seeds around the country and the world. Diener Seed Company was quite well known and especially known for his gladioli. And then Gene Corvey's vegetable farm, which is where the parking lot, one of the parking lots closest to the campus of College of Marin is. This is where they put up all those solar panels and things like that. You're looking at Kent Woodlands in the background. Corvey was an immigrant from Italy and had this wonderful garden. And so you go up in the air, we'll see this picture again in the 1920s and 30s, and you had a farming community still. And it was just starting to grow as a bedroom community. And then heading out to Greenbrae, Richard loves this picture. I love this picture from the hills above Greenbrae, taken by Bob Huff. And what a nice rural scene. This is Sir Francis Drake going right through Bonaire Hill, as Richard showed. And the the Greenbrae Dairy. Well, what happened there? There's the Greenbrae Dairy in 1931 from straight up in the air, taken for a mapping photo. Highway 101 is off to the right here, and Sir Francis Drake, newly named and straightened, because the old road used to go around the marsh. See, this is all marsh. I'm hoping you can all see my cursor. And then sort of wound around the hills. They blazed a new road from the new highway, because this highway was built in 1929 and 1930. So they needed a connection. And that's when they named it Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. And that's what we're talking about a lot in the news these days, about whether to change the name or not. Well, here's your Greenbrae Dairy, and here's exactly what it looks like today. This is Eliseo. It heads up into Greenbrae. Here's the gas station that Richard was talking about in Sir Francis Drake. I'll go back. And I think that kind of flutters because these are accidentally dissolving. And then let's look at a little bit of subdivision of neighborhoods that came from incredible old estates from very wealthy San Franciscans who came to Kentfield for the beautiful weather and to get away from the rigors of the city. This is Hall McAllister's tremendous mansion on the county road that is now Sir Francis Drake going across in front. And you can see the junction of Laurel Grove off to the right, just to orient. The photo was probably taken from Wolf Grade, looking towards Larkspur. So there is Hall McAllister's mansion. Well, it was on this area that is now Miramonte. You have Rosebank and McAllister, and then Kentfield Gardens down here. Well, let's take this picture and look exactly what it looked like in a survey. This is another one. It's a little hard to orient yourself, but the solid land that makes that point out into the marsh is where McAllister built his mansion, and he had a little farm there basically too. He had a hill with a summer house on the top, and then he had stables and a chicken house and a dairy, and then his big residence over to the right. So he had a pretty self-sustaining little operation there. He probably had a tenant farmer who took care of it. Quite a little spot on this point of land going out into the marsh. Well, in 1906, after Hall McAllister had died and his heirs had had the property for a while and they finally sold it, they subdivided it as Miramonte and laid out roads over his old property. See how that lines up fairly well. And they left a big area here up towards the upper right where the mansion was. And for many years, the mansion continued to stay there until it was finally torn down. This is a view from 1952, still same view. And there you can still see the mansion is standing, but it was torn down. And finally that area was developed too with a cul-de-sac. So this is Miramonte through the ages. Here's Basic School over on the right. So I'll go back again through this just because it's sort of fun. They're all lined up. Today, 1952, 1906, and the 1880s. Another grand mansion was that of Morton Fisher. He built it for his wife, Catherine, in the early 1880s. It was a tremendous building, considered to be one of the finest mansions in Marin County. And it was off of Laurel Grove Avenue. And unfortunately, his wife died shortly after it was completed. And she had had so much to do with the planning and the design and the furnishing of it. And it was very tragic that she wasn't able to enjoy it. And Mr. Fisher just couldn't stand to be there. But she had had it surveyed in 1881. And so here's Laurel Grove taking in the lower left, and Macon Grade heading up the hill over to San Rafael. And this was subdivided in 1930 as Del Mesa. So you see they took her property and divided it up and built some new roads. And here's Del Mesa in 1952, as it's been pretty much built up. And here it is today. All starting from an estate with that gorgeous old mansion with views of Mount Tamalpais, turned into a hotel for a while called the Montview Hotel. And then we'll go down to Greenbrae again and look at, let's see how our time is here. I don't want to go too long, but here's Greenbrae as we know it today. Again, 101 on the right and Sir Francis Drake on the bottom. And here's Greenbrae in the good old days in 1931. You notice that if you're going to buy a new house that's built on bare land, you're going to plant trees. A lot of people considered it to be barren, or you want trees for shade, of course, or for privacy. But it really changes the landscape from what is natural, open grassland, oak savanna, really changes it to have houses built on it. And then here we have, again, the Greenbrier Boardwalk, the crowded parking lot of the Larkspur Ferry Terminal and the 101 interchange. Going back, this is very similar to the view I showed from an oblique view of Wood Island and the loading dock for the Hutchinson's Quarry in 1931. But you can see how things have changed. And by the way, this being recorded, I might be rushing through some of these. You might want to look at these more carefully. So you can look it up on the website and see this again and spend time peeking in and going, wait, what's that down there? And what's that over there? And how did that, oh my gosh, look at that. So I hope you do that. Here's 101 as it's heading up over what we call Cal Park Hill towards San Rafael. And this is it in 1931. And you can see the old Tiburon to San Rafael road that was built in the late 1800s, 1899. I think it was finished in the early 1900s as it winds its way over the hill. And part of the road still exists as Tiburon Boulevard going down into San Rafael on the other side. But this was the way up over what they used to call Tennessee Pass, and today we call Cal Park Hill. And it's a freeway, of course, going over there. And there's a view, Richard showed a similar one of the highway. By now it's 4 lanes going over through the big cut into San Rafael, and our lovely billboards. And I guess the trivia question would be, who remembers the last billboard in Marin County? Because they banned them. And my guess is it was the one right over the hill there. As you came down the hill into San Rafael, there was a billboard over to the right above the motor movies. And somebody burned it down, and I think that was the last billboard. Richard noted the Bonaire Hotel, and we're going to look at that property a little. It was a very elegant hotel built by Mrs. Manlove, who was a hotel operator around the county and in San Francisco. And I had some grand days of visitors coming and enjoying the creek and hiking and fishing and swimming. At the Antique Kent California Room's map annex in the collection of survey maps, we recently had donated from the Newt Engineering this incredibly detailed map done by Warren Newt in 1949 as they were preparing the land to build Marin General Hospital. And you can see in the lower left that he documented every little tree, palm tree, this and that, and up in the upper right, the old swimming pool that was down by the bay. A wonderful document of things gone. It had the foundation of the old hotel. So if somebody wanted to do a detailed architectural study of the Bonaire Hotel, it was a very beautiful structure. This could come in handy. Maybe someday somebody will want to do that. But another old map in our collection shows the hotel at the bottom, but also the guest cottages that were up in the hills above it. And they had names like the Bellevue, the Klondike Cottage, the Fern, Wren, Oak, and Rose. And so you could, instead of staying in the hotel, have a beautiful little cottage. Well, so using this map, I was able to use an old aerial photo from 1946 and place exactly where all of these cabins and structures in the hotel were sitting. And even the pool shows in that 1946 aerial photo. And then on the right, you see what it looks like today with a sense of where all these cabins and buildings were. But as you can see, it's a very different scene. And archaeologists aren't going to do very well in finding any remnant of the grand days of the Bonaire Hotel. And here's a side-by-side view as development occurred on the property to today. Now, to get closer to the end, let's look at the lower end of Corte Madera Creek and the houseboats, often called arcs, that lined Corte Madera Creek all the way from up in the Bonaire area, Bonaire Bridge, and lining them all the way down here to where Highway 101 crossed, and then across to the Greenbrier Boardwalk. And we still have portions in Larkspur and also the Greenbrier Boardwalk. But it must have been a lovely existence being on the creek there. You could have a boat, you had beautiful views, you had fresh air, and what a life. And this was quite an active community in Marin, kind of maybe in some cases a different kind of people, but not always. Here's a view that similar to the one that Richard showed from up on a Scowls Hill, looking towards Greenbray, and you can see all of the houseboats lining the creek. You can even see in the left there a schooner that might be grounded. Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society and the Antique Kent California Room have detailed maps going back over 100 years of these houseboats and arcs. And it's fun to see some of them. This one the KGHS has, and you can see that one is called Casa del Mar and another one is called Dixie Doodle. And a lot of people named their arc as their place to come for the summer, and a number of people lived there year round. Here's another map in the Historical Society's collection, and notice in the center, there's one that it's an old sloop set up on blocks about 2 feet above high water, and it has a little shed attached to it. So somebody has made a sailboat into a cottage. This area has been completely obliterated and changed. This is down closer to Highway 101. And this is one that I'm pretty sure doesn't exist anymore, because this is right next to the old Highway 101. And the highway was widened quite a bit in the 60s. And I believe it continued to be widened more recently. And this one is not far from Lucky Drive. And you can see Sir Francis Drake in the background, a couple of cars on there. But I thought Richard Torney would like this, because on the deck there is a big go-kart or a modified chassis. And some of you might remember there was a go-kart track in Greenbrae. I don't know if this is a little big for that or not, but it looks like a pretty neat little deal that was kept at this house right on Corte Madera Creek. Well, so the Greenbrier Boardwalk, what's a fascinating place. A lot of really interesting and talented people living out there. They have the lucky they're fortunate to be on the creek and have good views and good water and air. And so it's always fascinated me. And one thing that we have at the California Room is a very detailed map, and we have some others too, of the Greenbrier Boardwalk. This was made in 1939. And the reason this was being made was that the owner, Hugh Porter, was subdividing the land around it. And it appears that he needed to make official divisions of property lines along here in preparation for some further development. And there's a lot of detail. Look at how detailed this part is, and I'll go a little closer. You can see exactly where the boardwalks were, and it really gives you a sense that this was kind of haphazard, that they kept adding on and adding on and adding on. I don't know the full history of the Greenbrier Boardwalk, and I know there are others who do, but this is interesting because they diagonally across, they have set up a right-of-way for the official boardwalk. And so the boardwalk that you see had to be torn down and moved. So if you look at this today, the boardwalk, this is the same lineup. The boardwalk goes down where it had been planned to go. And many of these buildings that are here today are depicted in the 1939 survey. And many have been enlarged, and certainly things have been propped up and made a little more safe. So yeah, the boardwalk, what a place. Now here's a view of the marsh south of the boardwalk, and as it looks today, and it's preserved, I believe, as a natural area. But if you go back to see the plans of Hugh Porter that I was mentioning, he did another plan, and that was this. And these are lined up almost precisely. Quite a big subdivision on that marsh that included a dredged canal that was 60 feet wide that went into a turning basin, and a dredged creek to realign the waterways that were going into the wetlands there, and dozens of building lots. And notice at the top where the houseboats are today and were then, he left aside to be sold as occupied. So again, not knowing the history as well as I should, I'm assuming that when they divided up all those parcels, that the people who had those houseboats then had to buy the marshland that they were sitting on. So there's their subdivision, and this is what it looked like on that current map with the dredged canals and all of those properties and roads. So we can be really thankful that this didn't happen. And those of you on the boardwalk who are watching this can certainly breathe a sigh of relief that you're still not downtown yet. So again, these beautiful old maps, and here we have the islands that we can see. So the last thing I want to talk about, because I'm at 37 minutes and I have 3 minutes left, is the islands that were in the marsh south of Corte Madera Creek. Towards Larkspur and Corte Madera. This is a view from Cal Park Hill, or what I like to call Tennessee Pass, because that was the old name of it. And you're looking south towards Corte Madera, you're seeing the railroad tracks coming right down the center and the old highway cutting across towards Corte Madera and then eventually Mill Valley. And you see this, if you can see my cursor, is a big island. That's Richardson's Island that I had pointed out. And it was a landmark along the highway for decades and decades. Here's a little closer and later view. This was taken in the late 40s, the intersection of Sir Francis Drake and 101, the old drawbridge across Corte Madera Creek. And there's off to the right, in the middle distance, is Richardson's Island with the trees, and it's still there in this photo. And then a view from the hills of Greenbrae. You can see Greenbrae School, newly built down here in the foreground. You can ignore the subject parcels, but there in its great glory is the partly wooded Richardson's Island. And so let's look from the air at these islands in the marsh. Richardson's Island on the right, Tennant Hill. It was known just for a short time because the couple who lived on it were named Tennant. And then a little unnamed island, and those two are the site of Redwood High School today. And then you can see Highway 101 off to the right. These are the islands of the marsh. Another newt survey, N-U-T-E, by the way, not like the little creature that crawls along out of the creek. They also surveyed the site of Redwood High School, and they made a very detailed survey of Tennant Hill or Tennant Island. And you can see the tenant's house and the driveway. This is in the 40s when they built that, and this is in the 50s when they're starting to plan the high school. And so we have another archaeological record, except that island is not there at all anymore. There's a view of the island from the highway, not very good, taken out of the newspaper, but you can see the tenant's house on the top. So you'd look across from near Richardson's Island and see Tennant Island out there in the marsh. Well, there it is up above, what we saw earlier, right in the center, Tennant Island. The exact view today, that's Redwood High School. And the parking lots and the playing fields have all been filled in with all the rock and materials taken off of Tennant Island. And and then also the marsh has been dredged and made into the Greenbrae. Oh, whoops! I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of this neighborhood right across from Redwood High School. Now, when I went to Redwood, I graduated in '71. I was always curious how you would head straight down Doherty Drive, and when you got to the school, the road curved around the high school and then came over to Lucky Drive and all these weird angles. And it was only after doing this bit of study finding out that, well, that's because it's going around the edge of the island, the north edge of the island. And they used the rest of it as solid ground to make a firm foundation for the school buildings. Richardson's Island was settled in the 1860s by William Richardson, who was not related that we know of to the Richardsons of Sausalito, but he got a homestead there. And there's not very often that you see an instance of somebody applying for a homestead, because most of the land in Marin County was Mexican land grants. But there were some property that hadn't been surveyed and could be claimed. And Richardson came and he raised a family on Richardson Island. He had a farm, he grew hay, he had cows, and was there for quite a few decades. And here, although it's a little hard to discern, and I'll trace it with my cursor, but this is 1946, I think, Richardson Island. And a lot of the marsh around it has been made into hay fields. And the Northwestern Pacific cut its railroad tracks on a cutoff over to the San Rafael line, and it cut right through. And you can still see that cut, because when you go under from Tamil Vista and under the freeway to get onto the freeway by Trader Joe's, you would go sort of like this and back onto the freeway. You go under and through that cut that went right through Richardson Island. But almost all of it was blasted away and used to fill around in the marsh. And here's the exact scene today. The the new apartments where the handicap was, right in the center, Marin Municipal Water District above it, Tamil Vista going right through the center, and the 101 freeway a little to the right. Quite a change. That's progress for you. And so when you're driving south on Highway 101 and you've just passed the Sir Francis Drake exit and on-ramp, or if you're going on the on-ramp from Sir Francis Drake and heading south, this will be your view, and you see the Water District building to the right and the new apartments through the trees there. And you notice that you go up and over a little. Well, that's the last remnant of Richardson Island that you're going up and over. And if you go back in time, only just to the 50s, here's what that same scene looked like. There's the road going, only 4 lanes at the time, but going up over the island. And there's what's left of the island to the right, which has been blasted away and used for fill. Well, that's pretty much it. Looking at this photo, we're going to have some time for questions. And wouldn't you love to just look at this photo? Maybe we could have a program someday where we just spend half an hour, because I could point out all sorts of things. Here's Corte Madera and the road up to Kentfield, and oh, there's just so much to look at. But that's we're going to have to save for another day, because I have one more thing that I'd like to do and talk about, and that is Lori Thompson. I'd like to honor Lori because maybe not all of you know that she's retiring from the Anti-Kent California room. She's been there for almost 20 years, and she has been the epitome of the outstanding public servant who welcomes anybody in to research Marin County history or their personal history. She has been such a gracious hostess at the California room. She was raised in Corte Madera, so she really knows the county really well. She went to Redwood High School, just a couple of years behind me. Her time there, her 20 years there, she's helped patrons, from high-end academics who are working on some big paper. Frank Lloyd Wright, she's a particular expert in, and also to just the plain folk like us who come in and we want to know about our relatives or the house that we live in. She especially has helped the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society. She's instituted a lot of programs, public programs. Richard Torney has been one of the speakers you see here. I've done quite a few, and all sorts of people have come in and done these public programs. She was a great help in the research and writing of the book that I prepared for the Historical Society. Here's the board of the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society visiting our map annex. So Lori was just a wonderful support for that whole effort. And that's just one of hundreds of projects that she has been involved in. And I think the feather in her cap really is the California Room's Map and Special Collections Annex, which is over at Marin Commons. It's a huge room with tens of thousands of maps, and also the other collections from the California Room and the Cultural Services collection from the county. And Lori kind of almost single-handedly made that happen. She had the support of the library director, and a lot of us helped out. And I was very fortunate that she hired me to be her map archivist. So that is really quite an accomplishment. And Lori was really fun to work with. She is really fun to work with. And as you can see, her and Carol here, and I know that Carol especially is going to miss having her in the day-to-day life at the California Room. But it's basically, we're going to really miss you, Lori. And yet we really look forward to seeing you and keeping in touch. And hopefully you can come back and do some projects and help us out. And I just want to thank you, Lori Thompson. And I think that everybody who is involved in Marin County history would agree with me that Lori is a very special person and has made a remarkable accomplishment in the county. So thank you, Lori, and we'll see you soon. And that's the end of my show. And we can take some questions, but I think Carol will.
Yes. Thank you, Dewey. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Dewey. My sentiments echo those of Dewey's tenfold. Lori, I don't know what I'm going to do without you. I'm in denial still, but we do have a couple questions. For Dewey, can you tell us about the beautiful painting on the cover of your book, In the Heart of Marin?
Yes, that is done by George Dumont Otis, who had a studio on Sir Francis Drake from around 1932 until he died in 1962. He was a nationally known plein air painter who has an incredible story living with Native Americans at the turn of the century and learning about their culture and learning art, time in Hollywood, and settling with his wife in Kentfield, where he welcomed visitors to his studio. He painted all over Marin County, and that's one of his most beautiful pictures. It's a view from Kentfield up to Mount Tamalpais. It's owned by the Kentfield Fire Department. His widow gave it to the fire department, and they have it on display there, and they were gracious enough to let us use it as the cover. That's George Dumont Otis.
Dewey, could you, if you have the book, could you hold it up again?
Yeah.
There we go. It is
I
beautiful.
urge everybody to buy this book, and it doesn't profit me at all. It profits the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society. So if you are a Kentfield Greenbrae resident and you don't have it, get it. It's kind of thick. It has more than you might want to know, but I think it's a necessary reference for local residents.
Another question we have for you, Dewey, was about the naming of Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. You mentioned that it was referred to as Ross Landing and San Anselmo Road. We've written about this, and we have some information on our website, but wondering about when the name for Sir Francis Drake Boulevard was officially established.
Well, I'll give that to you in a nutshell, because, and you can get the whole story. I did a 20-minute talk on the origins of Sir Francis Drake Boulevard that is on the library website. You can find it, can't you, on the California Room website, with all the other resources about Sir Francis Drake, the Coast Miwok, and the naming. There's a controversy, I guess, going on still, even though some decisions have been made. But in a nutshell, when the county built a new highway out to the Point Reyes area, it didn't have a very good name. It was called the Manor to Point Reyes Road, and a local merchant in Point Reyes Station suggested it be called the Sir Francis Drake Highway, because it headed out to Point Reyes, where it's believed that Drake landed. And he felt that it would bring commerce. It was an internationally famous name, and that it would bring people to Marin County across the new Golden Gate Bridge that was in construction at the time. And the county supervisors accepted that, and they named it Sir Francis Drake Highway from Fairfax to Point Reyes Station, and then eventually beyond. And then the local jurisdictions like San Anselmo and Fairfax and Greenbray realized, well, there's this new road going from the new Highway 101 in 1930, that, oh, by the way, that was 1929 that happened with the new highway out to Point Reyes. In 1930 and 31, they started saying, well, maybe we should call this Sir Francis Drake too. So it's a complete connection from the bay out to Point Reyes, to the tip of Point Reyes. And so the towns accepted it, Fairfax and San Anselmo and Ross, and then the county accepted it and renamed the entire thing Sir Francis Drake Boulevard in 1933. How's that?
Good answer. Good answer.
Great. And if you have any trouble finding that information and additional information on the topic, again, if you don't see it on marinlibrary.org, if you were to Google Marin Library Drake, it's the first result that comes up. Another question we have, I love this question. What is the oldest original structure building still standing in Kentfield at Greenbrae?
Well, let's see, Richard might need to help me out. I wasn't prepared for that question, but there are some pretty old buildings still on College Avenue up near the corner of Sir Francis Drake. Have been fixed up and remodeled, but those are some pretty old, a couple of really old buildings there right near the corner. There are certainly very old.
Well, I'll chime in that map you showed of the McAllister development. There's a couple of small buildings that show on that map that I'm almost certain have been converted into residence. The small building that said dairy facility is a little cottage. So that gets that building back to the McAllister era.
And also the Kent House, which is now in Kent Woodlands, is still standing. It was built in the early 1870s. It's been remodeled quite a bit over the years, but that might qualify as the oldest.
Well, there was a remodel done a few years ago where they left one wall. So the original house is gone, but the old carriage house and stable was converted into a house about the time Kent Woodlands was developed, and it is still in place. And from the outside looks pretty much the same. And there was a smaller building, this is on Laurel Avenue, that was housing for some of the staff that is also a home. So there's a couple of buildings in there. And then of course, the house on Orchard Avenue that had been Throop Richardson's home, who built the Kent estate, has been greatly remodeled, but there is a small portion of that house that still exists within the expansion and remodeling on that property.
Great. This question about the boardwalk arcs, and did the people who lived there actually own the land? I think, Dewey, you mentioned speculation about that, but do you know anything else about their ownership of the land, marshland?
Oh, I think there's at least a couple of panelists who live on the boardwalk, because I can't answer that. I know they would own their buildings, but I'm not sure about the land under it. It looks like because of that division that they probably do, but I don't know.
Another question we have, someone who grew up in Kent Woodlands area in the 1960s. At the time, for them, it didn't seem as exclusive of an neighborhood as it is today. And they were wondering if that's an illusion, or was it exclusive even back mid-century 1960s, that time period?
Again, I recommend reading the book. You can get it in the library too, because Kentfield started out when it was Ross Landing as a pretty rowdy place with there was longshoremen and loggers and this and that, and it was certainly not a high-end place, but it was so beautiful around in the area that it was a very popular destination for the very wealthy in San Francisco. And you saw a couple of those mansions, and that's not all of them. The Kents were very wealthy, coming from Chicago. But then Kentfield itself developed as a very working class neighborhood that was kind of surrounded by these big estates. And as those estates gave way to those subdivisions I showed, then you got more sort of working class people and people who took the bus to the city to go to work and all of that. And Richard might chime in, but I think that now it's largely because property values are just so high that you could bring it back up to where it's you might use the word exclusive or hard to find a place to buy for under $1 million.
Well, Kent Woodlands, the original subdivision was in 1938, and it was mostly Rancheria Avenue and the lower parts of Good Hill. And the lots that were sold there were a little bit larger than lots in other subdivision around the area. And I think their intention was to attract the more affluent residents than the surrounding areas. And it certainly has turned into that.
Great. I just wanted to note we had a couple questions about where you can buy the book and also where you will be able to watch this presentation. As far as buying the book, kghs.org. And we also have copies in the library. And as for watching this recording, you will receive an email if you logged in after this presentation is done. And we will also post it on the library's California Rooms website. Question about when College Avenue was Highway 101, where did Highway 101 go after College Avenue intersected with Sir Francis Drake Boulevard?
Do I have an hour to talk about this? Well, in a nutshell, from Sausalito to Kentfield, it pretty much followed high dry ground, went over Camino Alto through Corte Madera and Larkspur, and at Kentfield Corners, it turned onto Sir Francis Drake, went through Ross to San Anselmo, and at San Anselmo, which was known as the junction from railroad point of view, also the hub, because it was the hub. It was one spoke of the hub went to Sausalito, one spoke went out to West Marin, which would have taken you along the coastal route to the north. The other spoke went into San Rafael, and that was the inland, what we know Highway 101 route from there. So it's a very convoluted route in the early days. It's because they were staying on solid ground.
Could either of you talk about the old airport in Kentfield where the College of Marin football field is now?
Richard can talk about that pretty
Well,
well.
that was Phil Murray, the Murray family. Actually, the Murray family sold the property to the Kent family that is now Kent Woodlands. And one of the Murray kids, Phil Murray, is attributed as being the father of crop dusting. And so he landed planes in the open field, which is pretty close to where the soccer field is behind the College of Marin. And that's where he would land his biplanes. Now, Murray's also had a garage along the highway, which is now where the Village Peddler is located. And he restored and repaired airplanes at that site. So there are some photographs taken from where Village Peddler is looking across the street and the railroads, and there's airplanes in the field out there. They just landed in the marshland. It wasn't a specific landing strip. And I recently learned that when they land the planes there, if they needed to do any repairs on them, they would just tow them out to College Avenue, right near where the College of Marin parking lot is by the gym, and tow them over to Murray's garage, just take them right down the road. So that's where the landing strip was. There were some other private planes that also landed there. And as I said, the Murray garage, people would fly their plane in there and have it taken over to Murray's garage to be repaired or rehabilitated. That ended before World War II when Phil Murray moved to Southern California to expand his crop dusting business because there wasn't many crops left in this area here.
And then there was an airport planned out at Greenbrae that would be a real airport, but that didn't come to, that never happened.
Another question, can you tell us about the old Kisiana house, which you do write about in your book, Dewey? And actually I have a page or two about that house. Dewey, do you want to speak to that?
Well, since it was a while ago I wrote the book, I'd say look it up in the book because there's a whole little section on it. So I don't know that there's much I could just say off the cuff, but it's well covered in the book. I know Richard has a few. You remember that the fire chief lived there, didn't they?
That was the Camp family, K-A-M-P.
So we have some old photos and some good description of it in the book.
Someone asked about a scale, which is really, I think, technically more Larkspur.
Yeah, that's in Larkspur, the Tiscornia property, and Jean Ascal had a vineyard and winery there. What more to say about it, but it has some beautiful old historic buildings on the property.
Right. And the Larkspur Past and Present book is a great resource to learn more about that. Someone asked about the tall palm trees near the location of the old McAllister estate. And any other, do you write in your book about any other special old trees in the Kentfield or Greenbrae area?
Well, the McAllister estate was later sold to the Hardy family. Elizabeth Hardy was nationally known for cultivating irises on that property there. And her husband had been on the board of directors of the Panama Pacific exhibition in 1915. And when that closed, the trees and the buildings were all available for sale. And it's documented that he purchased a number of trees that had been on display at the Panama Pacific exhibition and brought them to his property in Kentfield. So that circle of palm trees that went around where the old McAllister estate had been, and some of which are still there today, are from the Panama Pacific. And if you turn onto Rosebank Lane, there's a tree that kind of splits the cul-de-sac. And it was a special Oriental or Chinese tree that was from the Panama Pacific exhibition, and it's still there today.
Richard, you have some neighbor fans who are asking about the Raymond lot on Kent Avenue. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it was just a subdivision that stretched between Kentfield and Ross. It was done in several sections over the years. And I have it, one of my slideshows, I have one of the brochures from the early Raymond tract, and it says no shanties here. So it was just for houses. There were no saloons, no other commercial business. It was just for homes. And where the original Ross home is in part of or adjacent to where the Murray tract, or one of the sections of the Murray tract is.
And I maybe I need to apologize, but I cut a little section about the Raymond tract because I was going to run over in time. So I did have a little thing of, because the southern part of the Raymond tract, adjacent to where College of Marin is now, was originally subdivided as a little community called Rossville. And that never came to be. And then the Raymond tract was subdivided in the 1920s, I think, and took that up.
Well, that's one of the things that I had to cut out of my show for time, is that there was a golf course planned that would run along the side of Corte Madera Creek, roughly from Highway 101 to Marin Catholic High School. And the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society has an original copy by the golf course designer William Watson, done in 1928. So where Marin Catholic High School is, and the hospital would have been holes 3, 4, and 5.
Well, someone wants to know more about the wolf grade, how that played a part in the earlier days.
Wolf grade?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that was built as an early route over to San Rafael, from Ross Landing to San Rafael. And Wolf was the name of a druggist who lived on the other side, the San Rafael side. So it's always been an important artery between the Ross Valley and San Rafael. But it was put in quite early in the 1860s, I think.
We have someone who's wondering about the railroad going from Larkspur to San Anselmo and whether it flooded frequently when the railroad was actually running.
Yes, it did. The low-lying areas roughly between Kentfield and San Anselmo, they tried to build the railroad track so that they were above the flood line, but they did get a lot of minor flooding. And I heard from an old timer who'd been there when the electric trains were running. He said that when it flooded, the tracks were underwater, and as soon as the water subsided, the railroad would send a crew through to clean any debris out of the way. But with the electric rail being soaking wet, they couldn't use it. So they used steam engines to pull the electric cars from San Anselmo to Larkspur, where, you know, it was high ground on either end. But yeah, they continued to run until when the third rail dried out, they'd turn the electricity back on.
Someone would like to know more about Branton Park, its name and its beginnings.
I'll address that a bit, and then Richard could chime in, because I'd have to open the book to find out about the name, but that was the original location of Chipari's vegetable garden, and that predated Corvey by quite a few years. That's the 1880s, and Chipari was a immigrant from Italy, and this is again the 1880s, when Marin County really isn't very big yet, but it was on the rail line, and he had a big garden. He bought the property from Mrs. Ross. And like Richard mentioned with the Raymond tract, Mrs. Ross had a very strict deed restrictions to Mr. Chipari. And I don't know if they were universal or if it was specifically to him because he was an Italian immigrant, but it said that you can't have a slaughterhouse and you can't have liquor and you can't, it was a very restrictive deed. And you had to build a house that was pleasant looking. It couldn't be, like Richard said, with the Raymond tract, nothing like a shanty. So that was a big vegetable garden for quite a long time. And then Granton Park was developed there, and partly in the floodplain. So talking about flooding, the lower parts of Granton Park, but it's in the book too. So
I'd only comment that Granton Park is the place that floods first when it's going to flood, because it's the low spot.
Well, it's a good segue to the next question about fishing or large seasonal salmon, steelhead run on Corte Madera Creek. Is there any evidence or record of that?
Well, I know that if you look further upstream in San Anselmo Creek, basically the upper part of Corte Madera Creek and Fairfax Creek, that traditionally there were healthy salmon runs all the way up into the hills of Fairfax. And I don't know how that is, because it was salt water intrusion. It was brackish water all the way up to Ross, or probably somewhere around the Ross border or so. But I know that, yes, people fished and hunted around, and even in a lot of people's memory, they were out with their shotguns on their shoulder going out to hunt ducks out in the Greenbrae marshes and fish in the creek. So as far as documentation, I can't say right now how much, because I think you will mostly find the documentation a little upstream from Kentfield.
Yeah, I only remember in a couple of the oral history interviews I did for preparation for the book of people talking about having caught steelhead in the creek around Kentfield that they could in turn take to the local restaurants and sell them. So there were steelhead there, but it was just incidental that they caught them and it make 10 cents or so.
And I would imagine the Kent family, I know they hunted on and near the property. I don't know if they were into fishing as well. Another question about Native American settlements, specifically in Greenbrae or Kentfield. I know there's a great book by Betty Girk called Chief Marin, but Dewey, Richard, do you know of any other source material, or did you gather any other information about Native American settlements?
Chief Marin is a great source, and Betty at the College of Marin during her career there, and even her predecessors did excavations as they were preparing to build, for instance, the what do they call it? The community building there, the special name for it. The last one they're not tearing down, that one. There were middens all around in the College of Marin area, that upper part of the creek. And then they've been documented. There was an archaeologist working early in the century who documented quite a few middens down by Greenbrae, which would basically be where the shopping center is. And it's considered, and again, this is covered in the book to some extent, but that area of Corte Madera Creek was a very rich area for the Native Americans, Coast Miwok. I don't know of any permanent settlements. Most of those were either a little further south and a little further north, but quite a presence there.
Yeah, well, the area around Kentfield, like the Woodland Center, when that was first being built, there was evidence of it being an Indian settlement or burial ground, and areas in in the Raymond Tract along what is now Murphy Creek. That was a bigger channel earlier in the days, and that was a common Indian burial grounds. And there was also, where the creek, where it turned, where Dewey just showed where it had been removed alongside of that, was also known to be an Indian burial ground. I guess because the dirt was softer. And if you got to dig a hole with a stick, that's where you're going to go. So.
Well, I think we've covered all the questions, and we are kind of out of time. It's getting late, but I want to thank Dewey and Richard again for this wonderful presentations on the history of Ross Valley, specifically Kentfield and Greenbrae. Thank you to the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society. On behalf of myself and Lori Thompson, thank you for including the Anti-Kent California room in this lovely evening. And I also want to personally congratulate Lori on her retirement. Many of you who attended today know her very well, and we're going to miss you so much, Lori. Thank you. It's been an honor to be your colleague and teammate and partner in crime for the last 19 years.
Can I say just one thing? I just really want to acknowledge, thank you very much. You took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting this, and it's been a great honor and joy of my life to have been at the helm of the California room through the past nearly 2 decades, and couldn't have done any of it without Carol Aquaviva by my side, who's been there since almost the very beginning. And more recently, we were joined by Dewey, and there have been so many talented volunteers who in the past and present continue to help us and provide their expertise. And the community partnerships and outreach and all of the things we've done together have been so very fulfilling and meaningful. And though I will no longer wear the California room hat, my passion is local history, and I will continue to stay in touch and involved. And thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Lori. Again, thank you to Heather McPhail, Rebecca Sala, Susan Moreau. Thank you, KGHS and kghs.org and marinlibrary.org is where you can find more information. Thank you. And yeah, unless there's anything else, I think we're gonna end the presentation with that.
All right. Well, thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Okay, goodbye.
Good night.